be screwed, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 17th part of, What If Harry Potter Meets My Little Pony? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of tkepner on fanfiction.net. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. While they waited for her return, Hermione explained about their animagus forms. Well, you see, we were all at the Weasleys' home when this really odd wizard, OW. She glared at Apple Bloom for kicking her ankle. We do not say his name. Apple Bloom glared back. You saw what happened last time. This time he might decide we'd all look good as avocados or chickens. She shuddered after a quick glance at Scuttaloo. Hermione glared angrily at the other girl, then sighed. Okay, she said grudgingly, rubbing her ankle. This powerful wizard came when these three and Sweetie all said his name. He turned us all into ponies as a joke. Harry, Sweetie Belle, and myself were unicorns, as were the Weasley twins, Fred and George. Ginny, her mother, Scuttaloo, and the Gryffindor Quidditch team, Oliver Wood, Angelina Johnson, and Alicia Spinnet they were visiting that day he transformed into Pegasi. Ron and Percy were Earth ponies. She concluded her explanation by turning into a unicorn once more. Then he turned us all into Pegasi for the rest of the day. She sighed. About a week later, Scuttaloo managed to figure out how to turn herself back into a Pegasus, so the rest of us tried to do it, too. Took us a couple of days. She looked at Neville. So, you see, the only reason we have these forms is because an extremely powerful wizard forced our first-time animagus transformation. At least, that's what Mr. Weasley says he thinks happened. Neville was staring back at her, clearly unsure if she was telling him the truth. He was sure his mother would have said something to him if there was a wizard powerful enough to turn 13 people into Pegasi, well, someone other than Headmaster Dumbledore. Plus, he had never heard of ponies in such bright colors, and unicorns always had a pure white coat, and of the 3 unicorns in here, only Sweetie Belle even came close to that color. Harry sighed. It's true, Neville. That wizard is really powerful. He can warp reality. Back home he once made it rain chocolate milk and turned the clouds into cotton candy. He's the god of chaos. If it screws things up, or he thinks it would be funny, he's willing to do it. Neville turned a disbelieving gaze on Harry. Harry shrugged. I think he's cool, Scuttaloo said steadfastly. A bit unpredictable, but cool. Not as cool as Rainbow Dash, but cool, nonetheless. The others shifted uncomfortably. How about a game of Exploding Snap? Ginny suggested. They used Sweetie Belle's closed trunk as a tabletop. Neville was a bit stiff at first, but after the first round he loosened up and soon they were all laughing, even Ron. Scuttaloo joined them for the second round. In the middle of a game, about 2 hours later, there was a knocking from inside the trunk. They hastily cleared it off and Sweetie Belle hopped out. She transformed back to a girl. Here, she said, handing Neville an envelope and a half-yard-long stick. Twilight wasn't at her castle, so I had to go to Rarity, she explained. And then Rarity insisted we have tea. She sighed. That's what took so long. She was more than happy to help, though, and gave me 2 hairs. Then, as I was passing the orchard, I saw Big Mac, and asked if I could have 2 hairs. He was glad to help. She looked at the stick she had given Neville. Then, as I was walking back up the trail to get back, she gave a significant look to Harry and the other 2 fillies. One of the workers came over and handed me that cherrywood stick. He said one of the trees they were moving to a better location in the park had dropped it on his head. He thought, for some reason, that I looked like some pony who knew some pony who could use it. They all exchanged puzzled looks. Then Harry said, Harmony, and the equestrians all nodded wisely. Harry turned to Neville, who was looking at them as if they were all mad. When we get to Hogwarts, send an owl to Ollivander with that envelope and stick. Tell him the hairs are from a unicorn and a big earth pony. The hairs and wood were freely given by Rarity, Big Mac, and Harmony, and that you need a new wand. Any excess hair he can keep as payment for the wand. Harry smiled wryly. You can tell him that Harry Potter and his girlfriend suggested this. The fillies beamed at his declaration, while Ginny looked depressed and Neville surprised. Neville slowly nodded and carefully put both items in his pocket beside his father's. If you need an owl, you can use any of ours. Hedwig, my owl, I know would enjoy the workout. With that taken care of, they resumed their game until the next interruption. Their compartment door slid open. There were 3 boys outside their cabin. Harry recognized the middle one immediately. He was the pale boy from MDM Malkin's robe shop. The 3 moved into the cabin. The other 2 boys, thick-set and mean-looking, were staring at the hovering scoots as their expressions changed to ones of astonishment. Standing slightly behind the pale boy as they were, they almost looked like bodyguards. The boy was staring intently at Harry. They're saying all down the train that Harry Potter's in this compartment, he declared. Is it true? It's you, isn't it? Yes, said Harry, still looking at the 2 boys behind the pale boy. I'm Malfoy, Draco Malfoy, the boy said boastfully. And these are Crabbe and Goyle, he said carelessly, gesturing at them. Ron gave a slight cough, which Harry was sure was hiding a snigger. Draco Malfoy looked at him, sniffed loudly, and raised his right eyebrow. Think my name's funny, do you? He said stiffly. No need to ask who you are, he continued scornfully. My father told me all the Weasleys have red hair, freckles, and more children than they can afford. Ron's face turned red, as did Ginny's, though whether from embarrassment or anger it was difficult to say. Neville was watching with a slight frown. Draco turned his attention back to Harry. You'll soon find out that some wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. He glanced contemptuously at Ron. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. I can help you there. He held out his hand to shake Harry's. Harry just stared at him blankly. Harry had plenty of experience in dealing with bullies, and Draco fit the bill perfectly based on their previous encounter at MDM Malkin's and his current conduct. Not to mention what the Weasleys had told him and the fillies about the whole pure BLD nonsense. Plus how the Malfoys, in particular, thought they were better than anyone else. Harry tilted his head at the boy, not sure what to say, but Apple Bloom beat him to a response. She snickered. Then she laughed. Wrong sort, she said mirthfully to herself, shaking her head. Harry lives with Princess Twilight Sparkle. Our homeland's rulers, Princesses Celestia and Luna, are sending us to Hogwarts with him because he asked them to. And the god of chaos likes him, she said mirthfully. Politically and socially, I doubt you could bring anything to the table that even begins to compare. She snorted. As fair your snootiness, I'll bet you can't track your pure BLD back more than 1,000 years. Sweetie Belle, Scootaloo, and I can track ours back over 6,000 years. Without a single, she glanced at Ron. What did you call them? Squabs. And Maggles? Hermione supplied helpfully, Squibs and Muggles. Ron nodded happily, eyes wide with delight at her verbal assault on Draco. Neville's eyebrows were both arched in surprise. Without a single Squib or Muggle in the family. She concluded triumphantly. Draco and his goons stared at her dumbfounded. That's impossible, he finally managed. Nobody can track their family lineage back that far. We can, Sweetie Belle said smugly. Are you calling me a liar? Demanded Apple Bloom, standing and planting her feet firmly. Draco sneered, looking her up and down. While the large pink bow in her hair was a bit much, she wore custom-fitted robes. His sneer faded a bit. He glanced at the other girls and Harry, finally noticing that those three were also wearing custom-fitted high-quality acromantula silk robes, much like his own. Plus, theirs had what appeared to be gems for buttons. While the gems were probably fake, the robes showed the wearers were of high class. At the very least, these four came from extremely wealthy families. From his expression, it was easy for Harry to imagine the boy asking himself why had his father never mentioned these girls and their families. Especially if they could trace their pure blood ancestry that far back. No, Malfoy backtracked, just that you might be exaggerating a bit. Apple Bloom glared at him. Apple Bloom, Harry said quietly, recorded history here only goes back about 5,000 years. Well, he said he saw my ancestors planting trees with magic 6,000 years ago, so's I believe him. And so do princesses Twilight and Celestia. He ain't got no reason to lie. She snorted again. Sides, don't really matter how long. We know that there ain't never been neither those muggles nor squibs in any OAR families. Ever. She turned back to Draco and narrowed her eyes at him. Be careful who you talk down to. Wouldn't be the first time some nose-in-the-air self-important snooty noble got herself bucked into oblivion by talkin' 'bout stuff they didn't know anything 'bout. Unsure of what was going on, and somewhat put off by the girl's insistence that the three girls were purebloods, Draco took a step back. He narrowed his eyes and said, I'll see you at the sorting that will sort the wheat from the chaff. He turned and followed his goons as they left the compartment, slamming the door closed behind himself. There was a moment's silence. Blimey, Ron said, that was brill. Took him down a peg, you did. He bounced happily in his seat as Ginny looked at Apple Bloom with admiration in her eyes. Harry looked over at the two Weasleys. I'd rather have a large family and no money, than no family and a lot of money. Although, Apple Bloom snickered, a large family with a lot of bits wouldn't be so terrible, either. She smiled and glanced at the other two fillies. And we got both, right? They nodded, agreeing. Remembering the Apple family reunion, Harry had to agree, as well. He couldn't imagine having that many relatives. And Apple Bloom had insisted on introducing him and the other two fillies to each and every one of them, saying the four of them were her friends. But he was unsure of why she was including Sweetie and Scoots in that. Neither filly's family was nearly as large, as far as Harry knew. On the other hand, they now were certainly rich based on what the goblin said. He looked out the window at the passing countryside. It was starting to get dark. Almost at the same time, a voice came over the speaker system announcing that they would be arriving soon, and that they should leave their trunks on the train. Harry, Ron, and Neville left to allow Ginny and Hermione privacy to change into their robes. Neville went back to his original compartment to get his robes. Ron took the lazy way out as they stood in the hallway and just slipped his school outer robes over his regular clothes. Harry and the fillies had decided to just wear their school robes at the beginning of the day, not that they had much in the way of regular clothes, anyway. At the station, Harry realized that the giant wizard calling the first years to follow him was the same huge wizard he had seen at the bank. Hagrid was his name, Harry later discovered, and his jovial attitude helped calm the excited students. Their first sight of the castle as the boats drifted across the lake was dramatic and appealing, they agreed. Harry and the fillies took one boat while Ron, Ginny, Hermione, and Neville took another. Hagrid finding Trevor, Neville's toad, was a major relief for the boy when the little fleet docked under the castle. His cherrywood stick was tucked away in his robe pocket with his father's wand. Harry couldn't help but wonder if the headmaster had shared the knowledge of their animagus forms with Professor McGonagall yet. She did give the seven of them a significant look as she explained how the house system worked. The ghosts were a complete surprise, as such things did not exist in Equestria, or were so rare as to be only legends. Scootaloo was a bit confused at first when Professor McGonagall called out, "Aloo, Scoot." But her going into Gryffindor wasn't a surprise to Harry, and was a quick decision by the Hat. As she told them later, the Hat had said she had no real ambitions, so not Slytherin, studying was a chore, so not Ravenclaw, and while she was fiercely loyal, she was like Rainbow in wanting to nap a lot, so Hufflepuff was out. Her boundless enthusiasm for charging into cutie mark crusading, while completely ignoring any possible dangers, or at least downplaying them, pretty much marked her as Gryffindor material. Naturally, her fellow cutie mark crusaders, Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom, followed her into the red and gold house. Harry assumed that was because of the cutie mark crusaders' attitude of charging ahead without a thought. The Hat's reaction to seeing the monsters they had encountered had been an astounded, bloody hell. How are you all still alive? He had been equally impressed with their origins, and assured her that he would never tell anyone what he learned when sorting students. Although he did say he had never sorted any students from another world before. That Hermione, with her intense focus on books, went to Gryffindor as well, was surprising. But given her admiration for Dumbledore, who was watching over everything from his throne-like chair, and wanting to be in his house, maybe not so unexpected. And having so many of her friends in it already probably was a factor, too. Harry didn't know enough about Neville to make a prediction. Neville, however, seemed overjoyed at getting into Gryffindor. On the train, he had predicted he would probably be shuffled into Hufflepuff, which he termed as the house for those that didn't fit in the others. Which would greatly disappoint his Gran and Uncle Alfie. Based on the stories the boy had told them on the train, Harry was sure that Uncle Alfie's would have gotten along just fine with Uncle Vernon. Plus, he had the feeling that he should be able to change a jinx so that it would transfer from a letter to a person without them noticing, such as one that made him confess bad deeds to the wrong people. Harry Potter's name brought a profound silence to the hall for a moment, then a burst of loud whispering. Even those who hadn't paid any attention to the sorting at all were suddenly watching closely. Some even went so far as to stand on their benches to get a better look. Well, 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 said the Hat, a disembodied voice in his head as he sat on the stool. This is quite the mind you have here. It's all in here, you know. Your hopes, your ambitions, your potentials. Loyalty to your friends in spades, that would make you a very good Hufflepuff. Wanting to learn all you can about magic, that would be a fine fit for Ravenclaw. And bravery. Oh, my, more than willing to charge ahead of your friends to protect them. That's a Gryffindor trait, for sure. Your ambition is rather subdued right now, but it is there, so Slytherin is definitely a choice. Yes, Slytherin could help make you great. That house could help you develop to your full potential. Harry frowned. I go with my friends to Gryffindor, he thought firmly. I wouldn't be here without them. They saved my life in more ways than one, and I'll not abandon them. Yes, yes, you do make quite the team, don't you? I've seen their minds, they won't forsake you simply because you're in a different house. It might be difficult to adapt, at first, but you and they would flourish. Yes, Slytherin would be exceptionally useful to you. Harry and the girls had listened all month to Ron and the twins raging against the Slytherins and all things snake-like. In addition, while the twins spoke of the other houses, it wasn't always in the kindest words for Slytherin. The stereotypes were very deeply planted in the Wizarding Society, Harry had discovered while listening at the lunch table as the Quidditch team talked of the other houses. He would not allow himself to be separated from his filly friends. A herd stayed together. Gryffindor, Harry stated firmly. Gryffindor or I leave. Well, if that's what it will take, then it better be. Gryffindor, shouted the Hat out loud. Later, at the Gryffindor table and surrounded by both his friends and the Quidditch team, for the first time Harry actually felt welcome somewhere. These people accepted him for what he was. In Equestria, he had friends, but they were different. Or, rather, he was different. Not that most of them knew that. But he did. He knew he didn't belong. He knew he was a transformed human and not a pony. And those that did know his secret always took a bit of time before they accepted him. Here, though, they were all just the same as he was, people who could do magic. And having his 3 filly friends here just made it all that much better. Maybe, just maybe, going to school here instead of Celestia's school for gifted unicorns was a good idea. The food, when it appeared, caught the fillies by surprise. Not the quantity, or that it had so many meat products. What surprised them were the large amounts of pastries and sweets. Scootaloo dug right into the fish dishes, of course, with great gusto. She almost rivaled Ron at the rate she was putting it away. Sweetie Belle and Apple Bloom had already heard the arguments for becoming meat eaters, but they weren't convinced yet. Harry hadn't tried any meat dishes at their house and little whinging, not wanting to upset his vegetarian friends. Humans are omnivores, Twilight had explained. And their bodies require certain nutrients, proteins, and minerals that are contained in meat dishes. While you are in human form, you need to eat those things to stay healthy. And the animals here are not anywhere close to sapient. She had taken a big bite of the bacon Harry had cooked that morning. Besides, our taste buds have changed and this stuff tastes great. Still, it was one thing to know something was good for you intellectually and another to actually enjoy eating it. The two fillies carefully picked and nibbled at the meat dishes while piling up the pastries and sweets. And commandeering all the vegetables and fruits at their end of the table. Even though they were all tired, and it was quite late by the time they reached the Gryffindor dormitories, Harry and Neville managed to complete the letter to Ollivander. It was after their curfew, so heading to the Ollery was definitely out of the question. However, Harry went to their dorm window and opened it as the others watched curiously. He leaned out and bellowed, "Hedwig!" Neville Longbottom, Dean Thomas, and Seamus Finnegan all looked at each other, shrugged, and looked back at Harry. Ron just grinned. Harry ducked back into the room as a snowy white owl glided into the room. "So said Dean admiringly, "that one's a beauty." The others agreed. "Here, Hedwig," Harry said, tying the shrunken stick and letter to his owl's leg. "Would you please take this to Ollivander the wand maker in London? It's about a new wand for Neville." Hedwig hooted affirmative, and took off out the window with a stately grace. They spent a few more minutes talking before they all collapsed into their beds and fell asleep. For Dumbledore, Sunday had been hectic, as it always was. The students had been on their way and the castle had to be ready. The house elves had been in a frenzy, cleaning anything that didn't move, and quite a few things that did. One of them popped into his office almost every half hour to tell him that this or that was now ready for the students and to ask if he had thought of anything else they should be doing. He had even seen one house elf polishing the stones in the gravel drive up from the gates. Meanwhile, the professors had been going over their schedules, checking their supplies for any last-minute corrections, and preparing themselves for the onslaught that was to start in the evening. But now, the students had arrived. He had always looked forward to that moment, and today was no exception. It was his favorite part of arrival day, seeing the looks of wonder on the new students as they followed Professor McGonagall inside the Great Hall. And this year Harry Potter was finally at the school. James and Lily Potter's son had finally made it here. Safe and happy. That he was accompanied by 3 foreign students apparently from Atlantis, was merely icing on Dumbledore's cake. The girls were clearly powerful, as he had seen when they all mastered the animagus transformation. If the school made a good impression on them, then maybe he could expect more students from that reclusive country in attendance. He had been trying for 10 years to rebuild the Wizarding Society devastated by Voldemort. Trying to instill in his students the concept that they needed to live in peace, both in the wizarding world and with the Muggles. Pure BLD sentiments had no place and would severely damage the English Wizarding Society if they were pursued to their natural conclusion. Giving the pureblood special privileges in order to placate them while still being open and welcoming to the half-bloods and Muggleborn was the only feasible solution. Having pure BLD foreigners of great power marrying into English society would put paid to those desperate pure BLD aspirations. These foreigners clearly had no interest in discriminating against anyone based solely on their BLD status. All they considered, it seemed, was how people treated each other. They simply didn't understand what the pure BLD ideologues were trying to establish. Thankfully, watching as the girls were sorted into Gryffindor was a bit of a surprise. He had expected them to be separated, with Miss Bell going into Ravenclaw and Miss Bloom going into Hufflepuff. He hadn't been able to get a proper read on Miss Alou. She had spent most of her time flying either as her animagus or on a broom. She probably wasn't either Slytherin or Ravenclaw, based on what Arthur had told him. As he had hoped, Harry went into Gryffindor, not that Dumbledore expected anything else after his girlfriends had gone into it. Professor McGonagall was especially happy at seeing that, although she did a credible job of hiding that fact from the watching students. After delivering his normal end-of-welcoming feast speech, with the required additions, he headed back to his chambers. His night was not yet done. He operated to end of the privet drive and walked leisurely to number 4, using his put-outer to remain hidden in the shadows. No one was home. He shrugged, they were probably out for the evening. He didn't notice the two women in those shadows, watching him intently. It took only a moment to remove his custom Fidelius charm from the house. Now that the boy was at Hogwarts, it wasn't needed to hide him. It would cause problems for the boy at school if he left it intact. People would notice that the children of Death Eaters, who might resent him and wish they could hurt him, would forget he was in Hogwarts moments after he left their sight, only to remember him the next time they saw him. His mother's protection on the house would have to suffice for the Dursleys, who, fortunately, no one else knew about. The minor spell he had placed on the boy to not talk about his relatives would keep them hidden from the wizards. He turned, retraced his steps, and operated back to his office in Hogwarts, where he was jolted by the noise of a piercing whistle, a ringing bell, and a hooting horn. He stared in disbelief. His Harry Potter monitors were going crazy, and what they were showing defied imagination. Harry Potter was here and quite happy to be here, he knew, and yet the metronome was solid black instead of neutral gray, with the indicator wand as far to the left as it could get. It was actually stopped from being completely horizontal only by hitting the knick-knack beside it, a knight on a charger with white cotton-like smoke coming from its nose. According to the monitor, Harry was miserable to the point of considering suicide. The second monitor, the smoker, blew a steady column of thick black smoke that almost reached the ceiling, and its boiler and chimney were a solid black. Harry was in perfect health, yet the trinket showed the boy to be in poor health, at near starvation levels, and suffering from broken bones and injured organs. The worst, though, was the spinner, the one that monitored the protection provided to the Dursley home by Lily's love, and fostered by her sister. That one was stopped dead and completely black. The protective charm had failed entirely. The boy did not consider the Dursleys' home to be his home, and vice versa. Almost as an afterthought, he looked at the last two. The stoplight was still green, showing that no one was trying to separate Harry from the Dursleys, but there was one tiny thin band of black from several weeks ago. The globe monitoring the minor Fidelius charm on Harry was clear, as it should be, because he had just cancelled the charm, himself. This was a catastrophe. His mother's protection on the Dursley home had collapsed. How could that have happened? Well, at least the boy was safe here at Hogwarts. The headmaster stiffened. "Skiffy," he called. "Skiffy, be here, Mr. Dumbledore," came the almost immediate response from his Hogwarts personal house elf. Dumbledore turned to him. "Is Harry Potter in bed?" "Skiffy will check," said the little creature before disappearing with a POP. Almost immediately, he returned. The old wizard paused only long enough to hear the house elf say, "Yes, Mr. Dumbledore," before disapparating away, back to the Dursleys. He missed the rest of the Skiffy's response, "Mr. Potter be in his bed." The boy was safe, so he needed to see what had happened at the Dursleys. He would decipher why the other monitoring spells were malfunctioning when he returned. Minutes later, wand in hand, he was walking briskly up Privet Drive, his robes billowing in his wake. He would have used his put-outer to douse the street lights, but he was in too much of a hurry to bother. He was so intent on getting to the Dursley house at the other end of the street that he again failed to notice that two women watched him just as intently, one on each side of the street. Dumbledore was in such a hurry that he cut across several lawns to shorten the distance instead of following the pavement. He peered at the house closely. It gave off the air of a house unlived in for a number of weeks. The grass was taller than the neighbors and the bushes in front looked a bit neglected. Which it should, if the Dursleys had been gone for over a month. Now that he thought about it, the Dursleys should be at home this late at night. Tomorrow was, after all, a normal school day and their child needed his rest. He rang the doorbell and waited. He rang it again. Nothing stirred in the house. He knocked, loudly. Still nothing stirred. He looked around and didn't see anyone watching from the surrounding houses. He pointed his wand at the door and whispered, "Hominum revelio." He frowned as the spell revealed that no one was in the house. Surely the Dursleys would have returned from their vacation by now, if only to ensure that their son was in school on time. He quickly unlocked the door with a spell and stepped inside, pulling the door closed behind himself. The watchers, one now across the street from number 4 and the other maintaining her post, exchanged frustrated looks. The one across the street ran up to front windows and peeked inside. The old wizard looked around the entry, then cast another spell. This one blacked the windows so no one could observe him. A quick lumos let him see clearly the mound of clothes thrown on the sitting room floor and the open door of the cupboard under the stairs. Puzzled, he walked over and looked inside. "Oh, my," was all he could say as he took in the childish scrawl that said, "Harry's room," on the wall, the papers tacked around it, the marks and stains on the wall clearly defining where a cot had been placed, and the dirty stained floor that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. He straightened and leaned against the door frame. "How could you?" "He's your nephew," he said softly, looking around the spotless sitting room with its pictures that showed a very fat child, a very overweight man, and a skinny woman with a face that reminded him of a horse. Nowhere in sight was there a picture that showed Harry. And the fat child would never have been able to fit inside that tiny cupboard. With heavy steps, the wizard slowly made his way up the stairs. He looked in the first bedroom, a messy child's room filled with the normal detritus of discarded clothes and toys. The sign on its door, in a fancy script on a bronze plaque, said Dudley's room. The second, smaller, room was filled entirely with what could only be broken toys and equipment, all looking quite expensive looking. There was a sign on its door, like the first, that said, Dudley's room. The third bedroom, larger than the second one, was even more pristine than the sitting room. It had a neat bed, bedside table, dresser, and armchair. All were tastefully arranged and color-coordinated with the walls and framed pictures. It looked more like a furniture showroom than a room someone lived in. Obviously, this was a guest room. There was no sign on its door. The final door led to a much larger room, the parents' bedroom, he surmised, based on the pictures of both Dursleys when they were much younger that were displayed on the two bedside tables. He slowly walked down the stairs shaking his head. "Do you not realize what you have done?" he asked the absent family. He stared into the sitting room, again. A typical middle-class home. The furnishings were fairly new, the rug and curtains in decent shape. Nothing looked either worn or seriously used. A well-cared-for home, a model of what one might expect a normal Muggle family to have and live in. A family of 3, with a father, mother, and child. No one would ever suspect that another child lived there, as well. Only in the cupboard under the stairs was evidence otherwise. That was the only suggestion that things were not as they appeared on the surface. That maybe this perfect home wasn't nearly as perfect as the owners wanted it to appear. And what it suggested about Harry's relationship with his relatives was ugly, indeed. He needed to know. He had to know what had happened here. He thought a moment, then cast the Point Me spell. They were quite some distance away, he discovered. He frowned, thinking. Arabella and Minerva had mentioned that the Dursleys were away since the beginning of August, staying at one of a chain of places called the Queen's Resort. That had explained why Harry was staying with the Atlanteans. He remembered Arabella mentioning something about the Dursleys being in Woking. He had never been there. He sighed, and disapparated back to Hogwarts for a broom. Dawn was still hours away when he landed his broom on the outskirts of the town. He cast a Notice Me Not on himself, recast the Point Me spell, then started walking. Half an hour later he was standing in front of the local constabulary building, a two-story sturdy brick building separated from the pavement by an iron railing and a brick-paved empty space wider than the pavement. He shook his head ruefully, a queen's resort, indeed. Muggles certainly had a dry wit at times. He slowly made his way inside to an officer at a desk inside. "Excuse me," he said, eyes twinkling, "can you tell me if you have a Mr. or Mrs. Dursley here?" With the help of a small spell, the officer was more than willing to direct him to the cell in which they held Mrs. Dursley. The wizard sent the man back to his desk with a quiet command and an obliviate. He would ignore all sounds and flashes of light he might see from the holding area for the next half hour. "Petunia," Dumbledore said softly, after opening the door and sending a gentle renervate. There was no reason, yet, to be stern. There still might be a reasonable explanation. She stirred, blinked, and looked over at him blearily. She ran a hand through her hair as she sat up and stared at him crossly. "Well, it's about time you got here. Straighten out this mess. Get us out of here." He shook his head regretfully as he stepped closer. She stood up to face him, her defiance on the border of turning into fear. He stared into her eyes. For a brief moment, he was glad he hadn't managed to put through that law making it illegal to legilimens a muggle. He sighed disappointedly. It was all there. How they had treated Harry. Or, rather, mistreated the boy. It had started with resentment, the sister Petunia had resented, the one who had gotten all the attention, all the praise, once she had left for Hogwarts. The sister that had had audacity to die and burden her child onto Petunia's already struggling family. Dudley had been a difficult child, Harry had added to her problems. He shook his head sadly. He hadn't considered the strain an additional child might have on new family. He should have arranged for a stipend to ease their burden. So, she had started to ignore him in favor of her own child. Taking her frustrations out on the boy when he did anything she didn't like. Her husband had already disliked both Lily and her husband, and it took very little for him to transfer that dislike to Harry. Everything had started to slide downhill for the boy as his relatives took out their frustrations with Dudley, and Vernon's office, on Harry. Year after year, Harry's treatment had gotten worse. Gradually, her son had picked up on his parents' attitude, and things escalated as he discovered he could do anything he wanted to Harry without fear of retribution. The punishments increased in scale and length as the boy's magical accidents, either real or imagined attacks as the Dursleys characterized them, had manifested. He noted with some surprise that the boy had disappeared from their home well over a year ago. He briefly wondered how the Atlanteans had found him. Perhaps, instead of a communications mirror, there had been an emergency port key and he had accidentally triggered it. In any case, clearly, Harry had run away, hence none of the spells had warned him the boy was no longer at the Dursleys. He had left voluntarily and not been forced by a wizard or muggle. Harry could have returned at any time, apparently. He had simply never wanted to. Not that Dumbledore could blame him for that. He, himself, would have fled a family that treated him so shabbily. Dumbledore understood that parents had to be strict with their children, and punishments should vary with the seriousness of the misdeeds that prompted them. Albus' own father had never been one to spare the rod when the occasion demanded he apply it. But what they had subjected Harry to was far from merely being strict, and crossed over into outright cruelty. Yes, he, too, would have fled. The only reason the spells hadn't collapsed years ago was that Petunia had accepted the boy into her house. That she hadn't tossed him out, or completely turned her back on him. And that the boy had kept trying to earn her love and acceptance. Dumbledore had never thought the boy would simply run away. Thus, he hadn't bothered to put a charm on Harry to either advise him that Harry had left or to prevent Harry from doing that. Or a charm to prevent the Petunia from simply abandoning the boy, which, he now knew, she had contemplated several times. Really, Petunia. You only had to do one thing, just one job, take care of the boy for your sister, he said, shaking his in resignation. Your sister. Your own flesh and blood. He sighed. Getting angry now would solve nothing. The Dursleys had planted the seeds of their own destruction, now they would reap the results. That explained the failure of the protection charm around their house. Without Harry there to provide the impetus, what little love she had for her sister's son had fallen away. Neglected and forgotten in her eagerness and longing to care only for her husband and son, without any distractions. It had taken this long for the residual magic to fade away. Or, perhaps, when he had removed the Fidelius it had exhausted what little magic that had remained at the home. It could even be that the protective charm on the house had collapsed months or years ago and the Fidelius, for whatever reason, had prevented him from detecting its collapse. He shook his head wearily. Not even Mrs. Fig had been able to spot anything wrong, but she was there simply to keep a watch out for wizards and witches who might be looking for Harry. Watching over Harry at times had been merely a happy happenstance. After all, who would think an aunt and uncle would treat their nephew so terribly? It was a failing of his, to expect people to be better than they really were. The Dursleys only allowed her to see what they wanted her to see. They always made sure Harry was in good condition when they sent him over to her while they took their out-of-town trips and vacations. Months would pass without her seeing the boy, especially in the winter when children tended to stay inside. Plus, they had certainly threatened the boy enough to keep him from saying anything that might reveal the conditions he suffered under at their house when he did meet with Arabella. And ever since last summer they had ignored Arabella. She had called them several times since then. Her excuse had been to wonder if everything was all right. She did, after all, really like the little boy. She had pretended to want to know if they had somehow found someone else willing to babysit the boy for the ridiculously low rate she charged. They had put her off saying they had taken the boy with them, instead, now that he was older. When she mentioned not seeing him around the neighborhood, they had simply said he was lazy and preferred to loaf around in his room, unlike their dear Dudley, a vigorous child who enjoyed the outdoors. Or that he had misbehaved and they were keeping him in his room as punishment. There was no way she could have suspected they were lying through their teeth, and that Harry had run away. He really should have checked up on the boy as Minerva had insisted all these years. If he had, he might have been able to ameliorate their dislike for Harry into tolerance. At the very least he could have ensured the boy got regular healthy meals, proper clothes, and that their whale of a son didn't use him for a punching bag. He shook his head sadly. There was nothing more to say or do here. Dumbledore knew he would have to come up with a way to protect the boy next summer. Perhaps he could persuade Arthur to take the boy in for the summer. He could re-establish the Fidelius at the end of the school year. Set it so that only the Weasley family knew he was staying with them. To everyone else, he would be an unseen shadow at their home. And if he was recognized at the alley? Not an issue, the spell would prevent anyone from realizing Harry was with the Weasleys in the alley, even if they were holding his hands, just as the spell had done for the Dursleys. Yes. That would work nicely. Plus, the Atlanteans would make a perfect decoy. He could spread the rumor that Harry was with them. By that time, everyone would know that the foreigners were really from Atlantis. It was highly unlikely that the Death Eaters would be able to find it. After all, for 3,000 years more powerful wizards than they had devoted their lives to searching for the elusive island, and failed. And if they did manage the impossible, well, so what? Harry wasn't there, anyway. Shaking his head sadly, he cast a finite incantatem, cancelling the charms on Petunia that had helped protect the boy, and the Dursleys, from the Death Eaters. As well as the one that prevented anyone from interfering with the Dursleys' guardianship of Harry. They certainly were not worthy of such a responsibility. He would have to find someone else. Already working on plans of what to do next, and wondering how he would explain what had happened to Minerva and Harry, he turned around and started for the cell door. "Wait," she said. "Aren't you going to do anything? We did what you wanted, we took the ungrateful little brat in. As hard as it was, we stretched our budget to include him. We raised and kept him safe, as you wanted." He turned back to her. "My dear," he said quietly, "I needed you to love your sister's son at least a little bit to maintain the protective charm I placed on your home. The little scraps you gave him sufficed, barely. However, when he left you, you forgot about him. The charm is gone now, it collapsed entirely tonight. That's why I'm here to find out why. Sadly, it can't be rebuilt. I will have to do something else, now. She stared at him with an uncomprehending frown that was slowly making its way to horror. I don't need you anymore, he concluded. He looked around her cell. Rather poetic justice, I think, that you are in here, now. He sighed. But at least they give you 3 good meals a day and clothes that fit. Plus, they don't beat you, no matter how much you might deserve it, completely the opposite of how you treated your nephew. He turned again, walked out the door, and stopped, turning to face her. You and your husband really shouldn't have been so abusive towards the officials when they stopped by. Otherwise, we could have had this conversation at your home. He stepped back and let the door close with a click. He looked at her one last time through the tiny window in the door. No. Wait, she screamed, throwing herself against the door and pounding on it. You can't leave us in here. Who'll take care of my daughters? She started kicking the door. Come back here. You promised to help us if we needed it. He looked at her through the closed door. He cast a quick spell and his voice came through for her to hear easily. Remember, my dear, you can't mention magic to anyone. Or you might end up in Azkaban, the wizarding prison. He looked around the facility. It isn't nearly as nice as this. Muggles don't do very well in it. You, your husband, and your son would probably go insane in a month. And then die. She stepped back from the door, staring at him in horror. He gave her a sad smile and walked away. No, he heard faintly through the door. He really should have listened to Minerva all those years ago. She was going to be livid. And, no doubt, shirty for a very long time. He wondered if there was anything he could do for Harry to begin to make up for that horrible mistake. In addition, he would have to prevent that from looking as if he were giving the boy who lived special treatment when he and the boy knew it was an apology. The sky was just brightening with the dawn as he sipped at his tea. He studied the 3 monitoring devices, now on his desk, and looked at his notes from 10 years ago. After study, he could see his mistake, now. His modified Fidelius had held back the results of the monitoring spells until he had cancelled it. Then the devices had been overloaded as the negative signals, trapped by the Fidelius, had crashed into them, overwhelming them and compressing 10 years of results into a single display. And the charm to prevent interference with the Dursleys' custody of Harry? It had backfired in the worst possible way. Arabella would be devastated when he told her, if she didn't realize it herself when she woke up this morning. His cancelling that charm on Petunia would allow her to realize what she hadn't done. Arabella hadn't known why the boy was with the Dursleys, just that they were his closest relatives. So, if she had noticed anything wrong with the Dursleys' treatment of the boy, she would have reported it to Dumbledore with the intent that he take the boy from the Dursleys. The charm against anyone interfering would have kicked in and made her delay saying anything, or even make her forget what had disturbed her in the first place. She could even have seen the Dursleys beating the boy, and the magic would have made her forget all about it as soon as she lost sight of them. If she could have, Arabella would have reported the Dursleys' neglect and abuse. She would have done so with the intent that Dumbledore save the boy, and put him somewhere else. That Dumbledore interfere with the Dursleys' custody of Harry. Dumbledore's use of Harry's mother's protection on the home had required he remain there, so Dumbledore wouldn't have removed the boy from the Dursleys. Dumbledore's only recourse would have been to modify the Dursleys' behavior instead of removing him. But Dumbledore's possible decisions didn't matter to the magic, it was acting on her intent, not his. He hadn't had any knowledge that would even have let him form an intent to do anything. He really should have told her why Harry was with his relatives and no one else. And the Dursleys' arrest? She hadn't seen it herself as she was still recovering from her broken leg injury earlier that summer. Getting around on crutches was difficult for an old woman such as herself. But the rumor mill had been wild, she had told him, claiming they were arrested, that they had fled the bobbies, that it was all a put-up for some telly show. All she knew for sure was that they were staying someplace called the Queen's Resort at Woking, apparently one of a chain of resorts across England. Unfortunately, if she had known that the Dursleys had been arrested, her intent in telling Dumbledore would have been for him to take Harry away from the Dursleys as unfit to care for him. They had been arrested, after all, and put him with someone else. Which, as a result, the modified Fidelius would have prevented her from telling Dumbledore the truth about the Dursleys' situation. The rumors she did report were only a bit more exaggerated than others that tended to circulate in Little Whinging, where the art of backstabbing your neighbor was apparently a popular pastime. Not to mention that Muggle-born children with magic tended to make their neighbors suspicious, as the neighbors never understood some of the odd things they saw and heard. Thus, many of the wild rumors about Harry she had relayed to him over the years he had written off as exaggerations, or even complete fabrications by ignorant Muggles. No son of James and Lily could be a vandal, thief, or thug. That Harry could be untrustworthy was simply ludicrous. A prankster, maybe. But the rumors hadn't mentioned pranks, not even to say that he had called them that as a defense. Harry had been staying with the Atlanteans at the moment the Dursleys had been apprehended, as Dumbledore now knew, and the charms he had placed on the Dursleys hadn't reacted. The constables hadn't been trying to take Harry away from his guardians, they had been trying to find the boy. Plus, Harry hadn't seemed the least bit concerned about his relative. He had been neither happy nor sad at their absence from Privet Drive. Poor Professor McGonagall hadn't had reason to suspect anything was amiss. Dumbledore had never placed any monitors on the Dursleys themselves, so he hadn't a clue anything wasn't as it should be with them. He had just assumed they had placed Harry with some friends while they went on vacation, as they had done with Arabella. As a result, his own charms had worked against him learning the truth. Then there was the solicitor offering to buy Arabella's house. The man had said he represented a firm that was planning a series of apartment buildings in the area. She had flatly refused, saying she couldn't leave the Dursleys in the lurch without a babysitter, and claiming to be a good friend of the family. She had asked about the Dursleys though, to see if they had been approached. The solicitor had told her the Dursleys were not at home, and thus he hadn't discussed anything with them. He assured her that when he did talk with the Dursleys at number 4 Privet Drive, when they returned from their vacation, that he would also contact her to give her their decision, and asked her to contact the agency if she changed her mind in the meantime. Knowing that the Dursleys were not selling, and that they were now on a vacation at one of the Queen's resorts, he snorted she had said no more of the matter to Dumbledore. Although, now, there was no reason for her to remain in Little Whinging unless she so chose. He would leave the choice in her hands. As for Harry, Dumbledore would have to redesign his Fidelius modification to allow his charms to work properly so he could be kept safe next summer. Or, just cast a normal Fidelius on the burrow and rely on verbal reports from Arthur, with regular visits to check on Harry himself. He could even send Minerva under the guise of discussing the Weasley boys' exploits, and the options for the next school year. She wouldn't mind seeing Harry occasionally in the summer, he was sure. Any Death Eaters to appear would trigger the alarms he had already set on their property. One course of action was a headache of spell crafting and exhaustive spell casting, the other a headache of lost time in his schedule. Although, truthfully, the time spent visiting the Weasleys was probably more productive in the long run than redoing his complicated spellcasting. It might even take less time, in total. He grimaced. And Minerva was going to be furious. He'd be lucky if she didn't start hexing him in the Great Hall at dinner the moment she saw him. Came the surprised cry, "What are you doing in here?" Dean said loudly. "Gettin' Harry, of course," said Apple Bloom. "Morning already." Harry groaned and carefully cracked his eyelids open. Standing beside his bed were all 5 girls, the 3 fillies, Hermione, and Ginny. Harry said a quick prayer of thanks that the fillies were dressed. Dean's yell had had him half convinced they had shown up naked, in spite of his continuous entreaties for them to dress before leaving their room in Little Whinging. Although, he imagined, if they had been naked there probably would have been a great deal more yelling. He attributed their being dressed to Hermione's presence. He doubted she would have let them leave their dorm room unclothed. Assuming, of course, that the three hadn't all just piled into one of their 2 apartment trunks and slept in the giant bed each one contained. Harry stared at them blearily. "I'll meet you in the common room," he said. They nodded, turned, and trooped out of the room and down the stairs. Harry could track their progress by the astonished exclamations of the other boys in the dorm as they encountered or saw the girls on the stairs. Harry buried his head under his pillow. "What the bloody hell was that?" Seamus half-shouted. "How did they get in?" Ron snickered. "They used Harry's apartment trunk," he explained, climbing out of his bed and starting for the first year's boys' communal bathroom. The past month of early arrivals by the Atlanteans and Hermione at his home had broken him of the habit of sleeping, and there was just too much fun stuff going on to allow that. The girls' trunks and his are all interconnected with an internal flow system, remember? There was a moment's silence as the others digested his information, then an "Oh, that's right," from Neville. "Which means more room for us in the bathroom as he has one of his own," Ron concluded as he left the room. Harry frowned. He wasn't sure, but there might have been a trace of jealousy in the other boy's tone. He sighed. They hadn't wanted to become obscenely rich, they had just wanted some spending bits for school. He had explained that to the Weasley siblings last month. He got the feeling they hadn't believed him that gems were that easy to find. After promising the others a trunk tour after classes, they quickly split up to wash up and got dressed. Soon enough, they were meeting up in the common room with the rest of the Gryffindor first years. The girls were grouped around the 2 Quidditch. "Girls. Thanks for letting us borrow your apartment trunk, Sweetie Belle, that hot tub is just fantastic," he heard Alicia say as he walked up. "I almost slept in it last night." Not a problem. I'll just move my things into Scoot's trunk and you girls can borrow mine until the end of the year. And there's plenty of room in Scoot's for us to share the tub." The 2 older witches hugged her, offering profuse thanks. Harry noticed that Hermione and Ginny were blushing for some reason. The Muggle-born and half-BLD girls in the common room were looking at each other and mouthing the words, "hot tub," and staring at the 2 chasers and the fillies with evaluating expressions. The trip to the dining hall for breakfast was easier to understand now that they weren't almost falling asleep on their feet. It helped that their guides went out of their way to point out easy-to-remember landmarks at key junctures. The older witches were especially helpful. Not unexpected, Harry thought. The possible reward of access to a hot tub simply for being nice to the first highs was a powerful incentive. Showers were adequate, but nothing soothed tired muscles or a fried brain better than soaking in a hot tub of water, experience had taught him. Although the tub he had used had been a metal one out behind the apple barn, with the 3 fillies, and heated by his and Sweetie Belle's combined efforts at a fire spell. They had gotten quite good at that, actually. It was interesting to see how different the wizards' approach to magic was than the way ponies did it. The ponies tended to use non-specific spells for a myriad of uses, whereas the wizards had dozens of specific spells that used less magic each. Like the levitation spell that unicorns used. They used it for everything that involved lifting. The wizards, on the other hand, had a spell for lifting straight up, a spell for lifting dishes off the table into the sink, a spell for lifting and moving furniture, and so forth. There must be dozens of spells to learn to accomplish that one action in an equal number of circumstances. Each used less magic than simply grabbing a thing in your magic and hefting it around, but required much more study to MSTR. Breakfast, Harry saw as they entered the Great Hall, was another table-filling bonanza of pastries and sweets. Not to mention eggs, bangers, bacon, and steaks. Apple Bloom quickly grabbed a platter of bacon and divided it up into quarters, filling their plates, and Harry's bacon, it seemed, was a favorite no matter your species. Harry divvied up a platter of pancakes for them. Sweetie Belle poured the pumpkin juice. Scootaloo piled their plates with chocolate-covered donuts. The other Gryffindor first years and the Quidditch team, all of whom had chosen to sit with their new friend, stared at the remarkably quick and seemingly automatic division of labor. And then quickly filled their own plates while there was still something left. Harry was surprised at just how much of his 3 plates he was able to pack away. He stuffed his leftover bacon and donuts, wrapped in a napkin, into one of his pockets. What he didn't eat as snacks he could store in his trunk's kitchen. Grinning, the fillies followed suit, leaving the platters in their section of the table completely empty of food. Harry leaned back on his bench seat and saw Professor McGonagall walking down the aisle handing out sheets of paper. Seeing where he was looking, Alicia said, "Our schedules for the next year," before returning to her conversation with George. McGonagall gave the group an odd look when she got to them. Apparently, it was unusual for the third-year students to sit with first-years. The occasional family member might do that, as the twins had told them back at the Weasley homestead, but for almost all of those two-year cohorts to sit together was most remarkable. Harry saw that the first-year schedule was rather simple. Today they had history of magic after breakfast, then charms until lunch, both with the Hufflepuffs. After lunch came transfiguration, and defense against the dark arts, both with the Ravenclaws. That left them from 3 o'clock on as their free time. Tuesday through Thursday followed the same schedule except herbology with the Hufflepuffs replaced history of magic. And Wednesday night was their astronomy class. Their only class on Friday was double potions with the Slytherins, and it took all morning. Then the mail arrived. Harry had quite a shock as well over 100 owls suddenly streamed into the great hall through a series of windows set high against the ceiling. He stared as they circled the tables and looked for their owners. As soon as one found his owner, or recipient, he swooped down and dropped the letter or package onto the student's lap. Or their breakfast plate if the student in question wasn't fast enough to scoot or lean back, or make room on the table. Harry noted with distaste a few feathers fluttering down, and quickly cast a shield spell over his and the girls' portion of the table. The fillies quickly followed suit, covering the entire first-year section of the table. Currently, their spells weren't very powerful, but the 4 spells were more than enough to keep their food from being contaminated, and the feathers out of their hair. They would get better at it the more they practiced, he knew, and it looked like they would be doing it daily. The third-year students looked startled at what the first-highs had done, but quickly followed suit. Harry shook his head. Hadn't anyone ever thought of doing that before now? He couldn't believe it. More likely, if anyone had thought of it, they only bothered to protect themselves. Harry found himself the uncomfortable focus of much attention. Look. There he is. Is that really him? Can you see his scar? Wonder where he's been all this time. Whispers followed him everywhere. Students stopping in the corridors and standing on tiptoes, or doubling back to follow him just so they could stare at him. Others delaying going into their classes to watch him walk by. It made him very uncomfortable as old paranoias instilled by his relatives came into play again. People noticing him was bad, people noticing him led to trouble. He felt himself shrinking down, slumping his shoulders. The girls saw the stares and Harry's reaction, and closed up around him. They glared at the offending students. The other Gryffindors picked up on it, too, and grouped around him, as well. While that made him feel better that they were close, it did make it more difficult for him to concentrate on learning his way to his classes. Plus, being crowded as a human brought up another series of ingrained reflexes. As a pony he had learned to welcome, in the filly's case, close contact while walking, standing, or sitting. Others he could at least tolerate. But as a human, such close contact, even with the fillies, made it was just awkward, and he found himself flinching at those involuntary bumps, half expecting a follow-up hit or slap. Watching Professor Binns, who had a wrinkled turtle-like face and a lower body that trailed off into nothing, float through the wall and immediately start his lecture was a bit startling. 10 minutes later, Scudaloo spoke up when he paused in his presentation. Professor Binns? What's it like being dead? Is it interesting? The translucent wizard stared at her. I mean, we don't have ghosts where we come from, and I would think you would find it much more interesting to go on rather than continue teaching history as a ghost as you have for the last 100 years. Or don't you know you're dead? Sweetie Belle elbowed Scudaloo and hissed, "Be quiet," at her. The ghost stared at her blankly. 100 years, he said in a monotone. Yes, sir, she said, it is currently. She glanced around uncertainly, 1991. She looked at Hermione. Right? He stared at her a bit longer. Extraordinary, he said, and then abruptly resumed his lecture. The first years exchanged glances, then went back to doodling on their parchments or making vague attempts at writing down what he was saying. His vacuum cleaner dull voice did not inspire anyone into really paying him any attention. That he didn't seem to even notice them, didn't help. Harry noticed several students giving Scootaloo and Apple Bloom curious looks as the fillies held their quills in their mouths and took sporadic notes. Harry sighed. They probably thought the fillies were nervously chewing on their quills. He had tried to teach them how to write with their hands, but they hadn't picked it up, yet. On the other hand, he would probably just end up giving them copies of his notes. Extensive and complete notes, as Twilight had drilled into him over the last year. You can never have too detailed notes, Harry, she had said. The way to the top of the class is to have superior notes. Then she had read his school notes every evening, asking questions for clarification. The answers to which he had to add to the notes. And if he had questions, they looked up the answers in the library and added those to his notes. Harry had learned how to rapidly take accurate and complete lecture notes. It had been quite odd, at first, as no one had ever cared about his school work. Not even his primary school teachers had seemed to care, except to single him out for criticism. That someone, some pony, actually cared had been a surprise. While he had grumbled at all the extra work she made him do, he really liked it when she praised his work. The payoff in high grades on tests had been gratifying, as well. Not to mention the celebratory dinners with lots of cake. After 10 minutes, or so, and as he said, the Goblin Rebellion of 17, Professor Binns stopped and looked over at Scootaloo. Dead, you say? Startled, she nodded and said, yes, sir. We were told you fell asleep in front of the staff room fireplace 100 years ago, got up the next morning to teach, and left your body behind. Extraordinary. He stared at her blankly for several moments and then started again, 52 brought about. 15 minutes later, he stopped again and looked at Scootaloo. Am I really dead? Scootaloo had been most of the way to falling asleep and chirped sharply at the sudden attention, then said, yes, sir. He stared at her intently. Are you sure? She glanced at the Harry and her other two friends. Yes, sir. Quite sure. We can see through you. You can you? He glanced down at his ghostly arms, frowning. Yes, sir, came a chorus of other students, intrigued by what they were hearing. It was certainly more entertaining than the Goblin Rebellion he had been droning on about. Extraordinary. He frowned as he looked around the classroom. Due to the blatant mismanagement by Minister for Magic, Albert Boot, he said, and continued his lecture. After 5 minutes, he stopped again. You are sure I'm dead? Most of the class answered this time, all in the affirmative. Hermione added, you're even floating in the middle of your podium. Extraordinary, he said looking down. He looked back up and a smile slowly made its way across his wrinkled and turtle-like face. He seemed to straighten up a bit, and his eyes lost their blank million-mile stare. He looked around the class and cleared his throat. I do believe, he said, slowly and still in his vacuum cleaner dull voice, that school is out. He licked his lips, and smiled, and said in a slightly louder voice, one that almost could be said to have emotion in it, in fact, I think school's out forever. School's not out for summer. School's out completely. His smile grew broader as he added, for me, that is. He looked up at the far corner at the back of the room and grinned. The class watched as he started floating in that direction, with students dodging out of his way as he went right through their desks and chairs. When he reached the corner, he seemed to suddenly zoom up and disappear. A faint, joyful laugh reached them just before he completely disappeared. Everyone in the now quiet class exchanged looks. What do we do now? Asked Hermione. There's still 10 minutes left in class. I suppose we should tell someone, Neville said. Maybe no one will notice, suggested Scootaloo. Nobody believed that. Who should we tell? Does anyone know how to get to the headmaster's office? Nobody did. Maybe we should tell our next professor what happened. Well, we might as well head there. There's only about 5 minutes left, now, anyway. At least we don't have to worry about being late to the next class, Dean said. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 18. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author tkepner on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.